Please, don't take my baby." The words came out broken, barely a whisper, but they cut through the chapel like a blade through silk. Every head turned. 300 guests in white folding chairs, a string quartet frozen mid-note, a bride standing at the altar in a gown that cost more than most people's houses. All of them turned to look at the woman standing in the doorway, rain soaking through her uniform, one hand pressed protectively over her swollen belly. Her name was Adese Bennett. Everyone in the Whitfield mansion just called her Ada. She had run 3 miles in the storm to get there. Her shoes were gone, lost somewhere on the gravel road behind her. Her feet were bleeding, and still she stood in that doorway, chest heaving, eyes locked on the groom, and said the one sentence that Marcus Whitfield's whole world stopped turning. "Marcus, this baby is your brother's son, and you are about to marry the woman who killed him." Nobody moved. Somewhere near the front, an elderly woman gasped and pressed a gloved hand to her mouth. The bride, Vivian Calloway, went the color of chalk. And Marcus Whitfield, the billionaire who had built an empire out of steel and silence, stood frozen at the altar, staring at the pregnant maid he had spoken to maybe a dozen times in 3 years, wondering how one sentence could make the ground disappear beneath his feet. What happened in that mansion over the past 9 months would take him the rest of his life to fully understand. But it started, as most quiet tragedies do, with a woman who had nowhere else to go. Ada had come to work for the Whitfield family 2 years earlier, back when the biggest house she'd ever stepped inside was her grandmother's church. She was 26 then, soft-spoken, careful with her words, the kind of woman who apologized when other people bumped into her. She had grown up in a small house in Baltimore, with a mother who cleaned offices at night, and a father who left before Ada could remember his face. She learned early that surviving meant working twice as hard and complaining half as much. The Whitfield estate sat on 40 acres outside the city, a pale stone house with more rooms than the family could ever fill, gardens that a full-time crew maintained, and a household staff of 14 who moved through the halls like quiet ghosts, careful never to be seen or heard unless summoned. Marcus Whitfield had inherited the company from his father, a shipping and logistics empire worth more than some small countries' economies. He was 41, broad-shouldered, always a little tired around the eyes, a man who had buried a wife 6 years earlier and never quite finished grieving her. People in the tabloids called him the Ice King of the Eastern Seaboard because he rarely smiled in photographs and never spoke about his personal life. What most people didn't know was that Marcus had a younger brother named Daniel. Daniel Whitfield was nothing like Marcus. Where Marcus was controlled and reserved, Daniel was warm, restless, allergic to the family business, always chasing some new passion: photography, sailing, a nonprofit that builds schools in coastal villages. Their father had all but disowned him for refusing to join the company, and Marcus, torn between loyalty to his father and love for his brother, had let the distance grow until it became a canyon neither of them knew how to cross. Daniel visited the estate rarely. When he did, he gravitated towards the kitchen, the gardens, the quiet corners where the staff worked, not because he looked down on the family's wealth, but because he'd always felt more at home among people who worked with their hands than people who signed checks. That was how he met Ada. It started small. A conversation in the garden about the roses she was trimming, a shared laugh over a burnt batch of bread in the kitchen. Daniel had a way of making people feel seen, and Ada, who had spent her whole life being invisible in rich people's houses, found herself drawn to him in a way she didn't fully understand until it was too late to stop. They kept it quiet, not out of shame, but because they both knew how it would look, the billionaire's brother and the maid, and neither of them wanted the relationship to become a headline before it became something real. For 8 months, they found small pockets of time, letters left in the garden shed, late walks along the estate's back fence line. Daniel talked about leaving the family name behind entirely, moving somewhere smaller, starting a life that didn't come with cameras and expectations. Ada let herself believe, for the first time in her guarded life, that someone wanted to build something with her. Then, on a rainy October night, Daniel Whitfield's car went off the coastal highway and into the water. The police report called it an accident. Wet roads, poor visibility, no other vehicles involved. Ada found out 3 days later, from a headline on someone else's phone in the break room. She didn't cry in front of anyone. She went to the garden shed where they used to meet, sat on the overturned bucket they used as a bench, and stayed there until the sun came up. She didn't know yet that she was carrying his child. Marcus took his brother's death hard, though he never let it show at work. He doubled down on the company, worked 18-hour days, filled every silence with something productive so he wouldn't have to sit inside his own grief. He didn't reach out to the staff. He didn't think to wonder if anyone in his household had lost something too.
Ada kept working. She had to. Rent didn't stop, and soon there would be a baby to feed. She told no one at first, terrified of what it would mean. A pregnant, unmarried maid carrying the child of a Whitfield, with no proof beyond her word, and a man who was no longer alive to confirm it. She managed to hide it for the first 4 months. Loose uniforms, careful movements. She told the head housekeeper, a stern but not unkind woman named Rosalind, that she'd been feeling unwell, nothing more. But bodies don't keep secrets forever, and by month 5, everyone in the house could see. That was when Vivian Calloway entered the picture. Vivian had been introduced to Marcus at a charity gala 8 months after Daniel's funeral, set up by mutual friends who thought the grieving widower needed something to look forward to. She was elegant, ambitious, magazine cover beautiful, and utterly relentless once she decided what she wanted. And what Vivian wanted, more than anything, was to be Mrs. Whitfield. Not for love, though she would have said otherwise to anyone who asked, but for the life that came stitched into the name. The galas, the board seats, the permanent, unshakable security of never again being the daughter of a man who'd lost everything in a bad investment, which was exactly what had happened to Vivian's own father when she was 17, leaving her mother to sell jewelry to keep the lights on. Vivian had spent years learning how to become indispensable to powerful men. She was patient, she was calculating, and she was very, very good at making herself seem like the only reasonable, steady presence in Marcus's chaotic, grief-heavy life. She noticed Ada almost immediately, not out of jealousy over a maid at first, but because Vivian noticed everything that might one day become a liability. A pregnant house employee with no father named was to Vivian's mind simply untidy, something to be managed. It became more than that the night Vivian found the letters. She hadn't been looking for anything. She'd asked Ada to fetch a shawl from the garden shed during a dinner party, an errand meant to remind the staff of their place more than any real need for a shawl. While Ada was inside gathering it, Vivian, waiting impatiently at the door, saw a small wooden box tucked behind some flower pots. Curiosity, or perhaps some deeper instinct, made her open it. Inside were folded pages in handwriting she recognized instantly. Daniel's handwriting. Letters to Ada, dated over 8 months, filled with plans neither of them had lived to keep. A sentence near the bottom of the last letter stopped Vivian's breath entirely. When the baby comes, I don't care what my father thinks. I don't care what Marcus thinks. I want us to be a family, out loud, not hidden in a garden shed. Vivian closed the box. She said nothing that night, but something inside her, cold and calculating, had already begun rearranging the future. Because if that baby was proven to be a Whitfield, Daniel's son, blood of the family, it would mean a claim, a share, a living reminder forever that the family had a branch Vivian could never fully control, and worse, a moral obligation that might make Marcus rethink everything, including her. She needed the maid gone, quietly, before the wedding, before anyone started asking questions about a baby's father. The campaign against Ada began slowly, the way all cruelty disguised as concern usually does. Small items went missing from guest rooms, a bracelet here, a pair of cufflinks there, always after Ada had cleaned that section of the house. Vivian made sure to mention it casually to Rosalind, framing it as worry rather than accusation. I'm not saying anything, of course. I just think we should keep an eye on things. People under financial stress sometimes make poor choices. Rosalind, who had genuinely liked Ada, began watching her more closely, torn between loyalty and suspicion planted so carefully she didn't recognize the hand that planted it. Then came the whispers among the other staff, that Ada was trying to trap a rich man, that she'd probably done this before, that pregnant women in her position always had an angle. None of it was true. All of it spread anyway, the way rumors do in houses where people are afraid of losing their jobs and grateful for any story that isn't about them. Ada felt the walls closing in, but had no proof of what was happening, only a growing dread every time Vivian's eyes passed over her in the hallway. Not hateful, not obviously cruel, just cold and assessing, like Ada was a stain that hadn't been scrubbed out yet. She thought about quitting. She thought about it every night, lying awake with her hand on her stomach, feeling the baby move, wondering how she would survive without this job, without any savings, without a single person left who remembered Daniel the way she did.
But she stayed, because leaving felt like erasing the last piece of him she had left. The accusation came 6 weeks before the wedding. A guest reported a missing diamond bracelet after a weekend visit. Vivian, present for the report, immediately suggested, gently, reasonably, the way she suggested everything, that perhaps housekeeping should be reviewed, particularly anyone who'd had unsupervised access to the guest wing. She didn't name Ada. She didn't need to. Rosalind, exhausted and cornered, was told to conduct a search of staff quarters. They found the bracelet in a drawer in Ada's small room above the garage. Ada had never seen it before in her life. She would learn much later, though she suspected it immediately in her gut, that Vivian had planted it there herself. Slipping into the staff quarters during a moment when everyone was occupied with dinner service, using a master key she had borrowed from the housekeeping office and never returned. Marcus was told that evening. He didn't confront Ada directly. That wasn't his way. He asked Rosalind to handle it, to let the maid go quietly. With severance, no police report, no scandal so close to the wedding. It was, in his mind, a mercy. He didn't examine it any closer than that. He had a company to run and a wedding in 6 weeks and a grief he still hadn't finished carrying. And a stolen bracelet from a pregnant maid was simply one more fire to put out without looking at it too long. Rosalind delivered the news the next morning, unable to meet Ada's eyes. "I'm sorry," she kept saying. "I'm so sorry." Ada didn't scream. She didn't cry, not at first. She simply sat very still on the edge of her narrow bed, one hand on her belly, and said so quietly Rosalind almost missed it, "I didn't take anything. I would never take anything from this family. This family is the only thing my baby has left of his father."
Rosalind paused at the door. "What did you say?" Ada looked up, and for the first time in 2 years, she let the truth spill out. The letters, the garden shed, Daniel, all of it. Rosalind stood frozen, unsure whether to believe a woman about to be fired for theft or the story that sounded, on its face, almost too convenient to be real. "I have his letters," Ada said, "in the shed. If you don't believe me, go look." Rosalind promised she would. She never got the chance. That same afternoon, Vivian, informed by a staff member loyal to her about the strange conversation, went to the garden shed herself and removed the wooden box entirely, letters and all, burning them in the estate's incinerator before nightfall. When Rosalind finally went to check the next morning, the box was gone, the shed undisturbed except for a faint smell of smoke no one could explain. Ada left the estate that day with a single suitcase, 4 months severance pay, and no proof that the only good, true thing that had happened to her in years had ever existed at all. She found a small apartment above a laundromat in the city, took whatever cleaning job she could find that would still hire a visibly pregnant woman, and tried to build something out of nothing. It was hard. It was lonely. Some nights she cried until she made herself stop, because crying used energy she needed for the baby. She never once considered going to a lawyer, never considered fighting the theft accusation, or making a claim on the Whitfield name. It wasn't in her nature to fight powerful people, and more than that,
Some stubborn, wounded part of her didn't want the baby to grow up known only as a legal claim, a paternity lawsuit, a headline. She wanted, if nothing else, to protect this child from becoming a story other people got to tell. But grief has a way of demanding witnesses. And one night, unable to sleep, Ada opened her phone and searched Daniel Whitfield's name for the first time since the funeral. That was how she found the accident report. It was public record, filed with the county, available to anyone who knew where to look. Most of it matched what she already knew: wet road, poor visibility, single vehicle. But one detail near the bottom made her sit upright in bed, heart pounding.
A witness statement, taken the night of the accident from a driver 2 cars behind Daniel's, described seeing a second vehicle, a dark sedan, following unusually close before the crash, then pulling away without stopping once Daniel's car went into the water. The witness hadn't been able to identify the make or plate in the dark and rain. The case had been closed as an accident regardless, no further leads pursued. Ada read it 4 times. She thought of Vivian's cold, assessing eyes. She thought of the timing. Vivian and Marcus had met at that gala only 8 months after the funeral, but she now remembered, with a chill, something Rosalind had mentioned once in passing, that Vivian had actually first appeared at a smaller company event nearly a year before that, quietly positioning herself in Marcus's orbit, long before the chance meeting everyone believed in. Around the same time, Daniel had started telling his brother, in careful, testing conversations, that he planned to leave the company entirely and take his share of the family trust with him, a share that, under their father's will, would only revert fully to Marcus's control if Daniel died without an heir. Ada didn't have proof. She had a witness statement that named no one, a timeline built on memory and suspicion, and a stubborn, aching certainty in her chest that refused to let the thought go. She told herself it was grief talking. She told herself powerful families didn't work that way, that things like this only happened in the kind of dramas her mother used to watch on Sunday afternoons. But she kept the printed accident report in her nightstand drawer, and some nights she took it out and read it again, unable to stop turning the pieces over in her mind. 7 months into her pregnancy, exhausted from a full day of cleaning 3 different houses, Ada collapsed on the subway platform and was rushed to the hospital. It turned out to be severe preeclampsia, dangerous for both her and the baby. She spent 9 days in the hospital, alone except for a kind nurse named Grace, who noticed nobody ever came to visit and started bringing Ada extra pudding cups from the cafeteria out of quiet pity. It was in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling with monitors beeping around her, that Ada made a decision. She would not let this baby grow up with nothing, not because she wanted money, but because she refused to let Daniel disappear from the world without a trace, erased as cleanly as his letters had been burned. If there was even a small chance that something had happened to him that wasn't an accident, she owed it to him and to their child to find out. She didn't have money for a lawyer. She didn't have proof strong enough for police to reopen a closed case. What she had was a due date 3 weeks before Marcus Whitfield's wedding, and a growing, gut-deep conviction that Vivian Calloway was not who she pretended to be. So Ada began to watch. She had no access to the estate anymore, but she still had friends among the staff, quiet, careful friendships built over 2 years of shared exhaustion and small kindnesses. Through a former coworker named Priya, who worked in the kitchen and still felt guilty about how Ada had been let go, Ada started hearing small updates. That Vivian had been seen going through old estate paperwork in the study late at night, that a private investigator had visited the house once, introduced only as a family friend, and left with a folder no one saw the contents of, that Vivian had grown short-tempered and anxious in the weeks leading up to the wedding, snapping at staff over nothing, as if some deadline only she could see was closing in. Priya also mentioned something else, almost as an afterthought, that Rosalind, the head housekeeper, had quietly resigned 2 months after Ada left, citing personal reasons, and that before she left, she'd been overheard telling another staff member that she should have looked in that shed the same day, not the next morning. Ada felt something settle in her chest. Rosalind had believed her. Rosalind just hadn't been fast enough. 2 weeks before the wedding, Ada tracked down Rosalind's new address through Priya, a small apartment across town where the former housekeeper had moved to care for her aging mother. Nervous, 8 months pregnant, and unsure if she'd even be let through the door,
Ada knocked anyway.
Rosalind opened it, took one look at Ada's face, and immediately stepped aside to let her in. "I believe you," Rosalind said, before Ada could even speak. "I've believed you since that afternoon. I went to that shed too late, and by the time I got there, everything was gone. I've felt sick about it every day since." Over tea neither of them drank, Rosalind told Ada everything she hadn't been able to say 2 years earlier. How Vivian had been the one to first raise concern about missing items, how she'd requested the staff search personally, rather than letting Rosalind conduct it privately as procedure required, how she'd been unusually insistent that the search happened that specific day, before Ada's shift ended. "I should have questioned it," Rosalind said. "I was so afraid of losing my own position, I didn't let myself see what was right in front of me." Ada asked her the question that had been building in her chest for weeks. "Do you think Vivian could have had something to do with Daniel's accident?" Rosalind was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood, walked to a small box of belongings she'd taken from the estate when she left, and pulled out an old date book, her personal housekeeping schedule from 2 years earlier, filled with notes on deliveries, guest arrivals, small household details nobody else would think to keep. She flipped to the week of Daniel's accident. There, in her own handwriting, was a note: "Miss Calloway car in for detailing. Right rear panel damage. Told garage it was a shopping cart. Garage tax seems doubtful. Charged extra for rush job." The date was 2 days after Daniel's crash. Neither woman said anything for a long moment. The accident report had mentioned a dark sedan. Vivian drove a black sedan. It wasn't proof. A damaged panel could mean anything, but it was a thread, and once Ada pulled it, she couldn't stop. "There's more," Rosalind said quietly. "Before I left, I found something in the study, filed in with old household receipts where it didn't belong. A folder with Daniel's name on it. I didn't open it, it felt like it wasn't mine to open, but I took it anyway because something told me it mattered. I never knew what to do with it. I was afraid no one would believe me." She retrieved the folder from the same box. Inside was a printed email exchange between Vivian and a private investigator, dated just weeks before Daniel's death, requesting information on Daniel Whitfield's plans to leave the family company, his timeline, his intended departure date, and specifically, a question that made Ada's blood run cold. Does his departure affect trust distribution if something happens to him beforehand? It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a smoking gun a courtroom would accept without more, but it was enough. Enough to know with sick certainty that Vivian Calloway had been thinking about Daniel's death and what it would mean for her future before it ever happened. Ada didn't sleep that night. She sat with the folder and the date book spread across Rosalind's kitchen table, feeling the baby shift restlessly inside her, as if he too sensed the weight of what they'd found. The wedding was in 12 days. She thought about going to the police first, but she knew, with the exhausted clarity of someone who had spent her whole life navigating systems that weren't built for people like her, that a closed accident case wouldn't reopen on the word of a fired maid holding a burned box of letters that no longer existed and a housekeeper's old date book. Powerful families had lawyers for exactly this kind of thing. Vivian would have an explanation ready before Ada finished her first sentence. She thought about going to Marcus directly, but Marcus had let her go without ever once looking her in the eye, had trusted Vivian's version of events without question, had been, in his own grief-numbed way, complicit in erasing her from his family story. Why would he believe her now? And yet, she thought of Daniel, sitting beside her in the garden shed, saying, "I don't care what Marcus thinks, I want us to be a family," out loud. She thought of the son growing inside her, who deserved at the very least to know that his mother had tried. Rosalind, watching her think, finally spoke. "There's a wedding rehearsal in 10 days. Full guest list, most of the board, half the city society pages. If you're going to do this, you can't do it quietly. Quiet is how they buried it the first time." "I'm not trying to ruin anyone's wedding," Ada said. "No," Rosalind said gently. "You're trying to stop someone dangerous from becoming permanently untouchable. There's a difference." The days that followed were the hardest of Ada's life. She was 38 weeks pregnant,
exhausted, terrified, and utterly alone, except for Rosalind and Priya, two women who had far more to lose than she did and chose to help her anyway. Together, they built a timeline. Rosalind reached out quietly to the garage that had detailed Vivian's car, and though the technician who'd worked on it 2 years earlier had since moved to another shop, he remembered the job well enough to describe the damage again when Rosalind called, off the record, as a former colleague checking an old detail for insurance purposes. Priya, meanwhile, kept feeding small updates from inside the house, wedding preparations moving forward at full speed, Vivian more controlling and anxious by the day, snapping at florists and caterers over details no one else even noticed. Ada also finally went to a free legal aid clinic, not to file a lawsuit, but simply to understand her rights, what a paternity claim would actually require, what protections existed for her and the baby regardless of what happened with the wedding. A tired but kind attorney named Mr. Osei looked over what she'd gathered and told her plainly, "This isn't enough to convict anyone of anything, but it might be enough to make the right person start asking the right questions if it reaches them at the right moment." The right moment. The word stuck with her. 3 days before the wedding, everything nearly fell apart. Vivian, perhaps sensing something shifting in the air, perhaps simply covering old tracks out of habit, had someone quietly check in on Rosalind's whereabouts and discovered she'd moved. A brief, unsettling visit followed, a man Rosalind didn't recognize, asking vague questions to a neighbor about an old employee of the Whitfield family, never identifying himself. Rosalind called Rosalind in a panic that night.
"We need to move faster," she said. "If she finds out what we have before the wedding, she'll bury it again. She'll bury it better this time." Ada barely slept over the next 2 nights, her body aching, the baby pressing low and heavy, every part of her screaming that she should rest, should protect herself, should let this go and simply focus on surviving the birth that was now only weeks away. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel's handwriting, "I want us to be a family," out loud. The morning of the wedding, Ada woke before dawn with a strange, steady calm she hadn't felt in months. She dressed simply. She had no gown, no invitation, nothing but the truth and a folder of evidence that might not hold up anywhere except in the moment it mattered most. Rosalind offered to drive her, but a sudden violent summer storm rolled in an hour before the ceremony, flooding 2 of the main roads leading toward the estate's private chapel. Rosalind's car stalled at a railroad crossing, engine flooding in the rising water. With the ceremony starting in under 30 minutes and no rideshare willing to brave the closed roads, Ada made a decision that still felt, months later, like something outside herself had taken over. She got out and ran. 3 miles, in the rain, 8 months and 3 weeks pregnant, her shoes lost somewhere around the 2nd mile when the strap finally gave out on the flooded gravel shoulder. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Every contraction like tightening across her belly only made her run faster, some primal certainty pushing her forward, that if she stopped now, she would never find the courage again. She reached the chapel doors just as the officiant asked if anyone objected to the union. The doors burst open. Rain-soaked, barefoot, breathless, one hand clutching a soggy folder to her chest, the other pressed to her belly, Ada Bennett stood in the doorway and said the sentence that stopped everything. "Please, don't take my baby." And then louder, clearer, the words she'd rehearsed 1,000 times in her head over the past 2 weeks finally found their way out. "Marcus, this baby is your brother's son, and you are about to marry the woman who killed him." The silence that followed felt endless. Then it broke all at once. Gasps, murmurs, someone's phone visibly rising to record. Vivian's face had gone bloodless, her composure cracking for the first time in 2 years of careful performance. "She's insane," Vivian said, voice sharp and too fast. "Marcus, she was fired for theft. She's clearly unstable. Someone get security." "No," Marcus said quietly. The word cut through the chapel more effectively than a shout would have. He stepped down from the altar, ignoring the officiant,
ignoring the guests, ignoring everything except the barefoot, soaked, trembling woman in the doorway who had just said his brother's name for the first time in 2 years without flinching. "Daniel," he said. "You knew Daniel?" "I loved him," Ada said, and her voice broke completely now, 2 years of held-back grief finally spilling out in front of 300 strangers. "We were going to have a life together. He was going to leave the company, leave everything, and it didn't matter to him. He wrote me letters. He kept them in the garden shed. She found them." Ada's eyes flicked, sharp and unflinching toward Vivian, "and she burned them. Ask anyone who worked in that house. Ask Rosalind." At the mention of her name, Rosalind stepped through the still open chapel doors behind Ada, soaked from her own dash from the flooded car, holding the folder and datebook like they weighed 1,000 pounds.
"I have the garage record from 2 days after Daniel's accident," Rosalind said, voice shaking but steady. "Damage to Miss Calloway's car. The same week the accident report describes a second vehicle at the scene. And I have an email exchange between Miss Calloway and a private investigator, dated weeks before Daniel died, asking what would happen to the trust if something happened to him." Vivian's carefully constructed world cracked open in real time, in front of everyone she had spent years trying to impress. "Those documents mean nothing," she said, but her voice had lost its certainty. "A repaired car isn't evidence of anything. This is a desperate woman trying to extort money from a family that was generous enough to fire a pregnant woman over a bracelet she never touched," Rosalind said. "I searched her room myself, Vivian. You're the one who insisted it happened that exact day, that exact hour, before her shift ended. You had a master key that week that never should have left the housekeeping office. I filed the return request myself. It came back a day late." Marcus stood very still, looking between the two women, something shifting behind his eyes. Not yet full understanding, but the first cracks of it, the first unbearable possibility that the woman he was about to marry might have built her entire place in his life on top of his brother's death. "Marcus, don't listen to this," Vivian said, reaching for his arm. "I love you, whatever this is, whatever she's trying to do." He stepped back from her hand, just slightly, but it was enough. Enough for every guest in that chapel to see it, to understand that something fundamental had already broken and could not be put back together by a wedding march. "Show me," he said quietly, to Ada and Rosalind both. "Show me everything." They didn't finish it in the chapel. Marcus called a halt to the ceremony, asked the stunned guests to please make their way to the reception hall for refreshments while a private family matter was addressed, and led Ada, Rosalind, and, after a tense, humiliating moment where she clearly considered fleeing and clearly realized fleeing would look worse than staying, Vivian, into the estate's private study. Over the next 2 hours, with the estate's head of security and, eventually, an actual detective from the county sheriff's office, who Marcus called personally, the full picture began to surface. The accident report was reopened, this time with Rosalind's garage record attached as a lead worth pursuing. The garage technician, contacted formally now rather than off the record, confirmed the timeline and the unusual insistence Vivian's assistant had shown in getting the rush repair done quietly, paying extra to avoid the job being logged in the shop's normal system, an irregularity the original technician had simply assumed was about privacy, not evidence. The email exchange with the private investigator, once traced properly, led to the investigator himself, who, faced with the possibility of his own legal exposure, confirmed that Vivian had hired him specifically to research the trust structure and Daniel's departure timeline in the weeks before the accident, though he insisted, credibly, that he had no knowledge of what Vivian intended to do with that information and had never been asked about nor suspected anything related to the crash itself. It would take months of investigation to determine, with enough certainty for prosecutors to act, exactly what happened on that rainy October night. Whether Vivian had followed Daniel intending only to frighten him into staying quiet about leaving, whether the crash was a terrible, reckless accident born from that confrontation, or something colder and more deliberate. Vivian would maintain, through every stage of the ensuing legal process, that she had only meant to talk to him, that the crash was his own error on a wet road, that she panicked and drove away out of fear, not guilt. The court, months later, would not accept the full weight of a homicide charge, the evidence too circumstantial to prove intent beyond reasonable doubt.
but she was charged and ultimately convicted of leaving the scene of an accident, obstruction, and evidence tampering related to the theft accusation against Ada. Charges serious enough to end not just the wedding, but every part of the life she had spent years building. The engagement was over before the study door had even closed that day. The board of the Woodfield Company, informed within the week, quietly and permanently severed every connection to her. The society pages that had once celebrated her engagement now printed her booking photo instead.
For Marcus, the weeks that followed were the hardest of his adult life. Harder in some ways than the day he first learned Daniel had died, because now he had to relive that loss knowing it might not have been the cruel accident of nature he told himself it was. He had to sit with the knowledge that he'd been so consumed by grief and business and his own careful control that he'd let a pregnant woman be pushed out of his household on a lie, without once asking why she seemed so desperate to keep her job, without once wondering what she might have lost too. He went to Ada 3 days after the wedding that never happened, not as a billionaire making a grand gesture, but quietly, alone, no lawyers, no cameras. He found her at Rosalind's apartment, resting after the ordeal, and he sat across from her at the same kitchen table where the truth had first come together. "I'm sorry," he said, and it was the first time in years anyone had heard Marcus Whitfield's voice break. "I let them push you out. I didn't ask questions I should have asked. I was so buried in my own grief, I didn't see that other people were grieving him too." Ada, exhausted and swollen with a due date now only days away, looked at him for a long moment. "I didn't come to that chapel for an apology," she said. "I came because your brother deserved to be more than a closed accident file, and this baby deserves to know where he comes from, even if that means nothing more than a name." "It means more than a name," Marcus said quietly. "It means family. If you'll let it." Ada's son was born 8 days later, in the same hospital where Grace, the nurse, had once quietly slipped her extra pudding cups. Only this time there was a room full of people waiting outside. Rosalind, who had become something like family herself, Priya, who cried harder than anyone, and Marcus, who stood awkwardly by the door until Ada, exhausted and glowing, finally waved him in. They named the baby Daniel. It wasn't an instant fairy tale. Trust, once broken by an entire system of quiet cruelty, doesn't rebuild in a single dramatic afternoon. Marcus formally acknowledged the child's place in the family, established a trust for his nephew's future, and, more importantly to Ada, who had never wanted charity, only truth, publicly corrected the record about the theft accusation, ensuring Ada's name was fully cleared, and that Rosalind, who had risked everything to help her, was offered her position back with a formal apology and a role expanded to overseeing the entire household staff, with new protections written into policy so that no employee could ever again be dismissed on the word of a single accuser without a fair, documented process. Ada didn't move into the mansion. She didn't want the estate, didn't want the version of a fairy tale ending where the maid marries into money and the story wraps up in a bow. She took a modest position instead, managing a small foundation Marcus set up in Daniel's name, funding education programs in the same kind of communities Daniel had once traveled to as a young man, chasing meaning outside the family business. The closest thing to honoring who he'd actually been, rather than the story his family's grief had frozen him into. Marcus visited often, first out of obligation to his nephew, then, slowly, out of something that looked less like obligation and more like the beginning of real friendship, forged in the particular honesty that only shared grief and shared truth can build. He never rushed anything further than that. Neither did she. Some healing doesn't need a romance to complete it. Sometimes it just needs honesty, patience, and the quiet, daily work of showing up. A year later, at a small gathering to celebrate baby Daniel's first birthday, held not in the grand mansion, but in the modest backyard of Ada's new apartment, Marcus stood at the edge of the small crowd, watching his nephew take wobbling first steps toward his mother's outstretched arms, and felt something in his chest ease for the first time since the night his brother's car went into the water. Ada caught his eye across the yard and smiled, not the careful, guarded smile of a woman who had spent years apologizing for taking up space, but something looser, freer, earned. Somewhere, she liked to think, Daniel was watching too, no longer a closed file, no longer a story buried under lies and silence, but exactly what he'd always wanted to be. A family. Out loud.